Right, well, I want to welcome everyone to this event and welcome to our home here in the Evidence Quarter. It's great to see a number of you from the Evidence Quarter come today. It's been a great place for us to work with like-minded organisations and collaborate, and it's been some focus on some really good projects for us. I'm going to do, my name is Robin Hewings. I lead the work of the Campaign to End Loneliness. I really want to thank you, our sponsors, for today. Firstly, from Togetherly, and also Sky, our thought leadership sponsor. We're very grateful to them for enabling us to do this work. And also for the conference that we held back in February. So thank you very much for that. So I just want to say a few things just to kind of set the scene. So I think if you're here, you probably are very aware of the Campaign to End Loneliness and what we do. But this kind of event is absolutely at the core of it. We're about building the evidence about what we can do about loneliness, bringing together the brilliant community of people who care about this issue, and finally making the case for action. And this is very much about action, this event. The purpose of this event is really bearing in mind that it's 5 years since the first loneliness minister was appointed, and nearly 5 years, certainly the same calendar year, that the loneliness strategy was created. And I think that we would say that there has been real progress there, but the question is what we need to be doing for the next 5 years. And as part of that, we are working with the Red Cross, with the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and with a number of other organisations to try to answer that question. Today's event, in many ways, is the first chance to answer that. And I think that what we're hoping to do is we're often very engaged in the details. And the idea of this event is it's an opportunity for us to really kind of look up and think about what we should really be doing ambitiously over the next 5 years. We have a survey that we'd be delighted if you could respond to, and many people already have done since we launched it just about a week and a half ago. But obviously, particularly for those in the audience and also online, we'll have our time for questions, which is another great opportunity for us to really kind of understand new ideas about how we can better tackle loneliness. To give this discussion a bit of context, those who are here in person will have a short, very small document outlining some recent research that we've just released. The ONS have been asking people about loneliness every week in a really consistent way for the last few years. But the error bars are always really, really wide every time they get analysed. And so what we wanted to do, we've worked with a researcher at the University of Glasgow who has kind of put all of that together, giving just shy of 25,000 data points to really kind of narrow those error bars and help us really understand what the picture is. And I think that some of this will be new, some of it a bit less new. So there's quite a familiar picture around people on average being lonelier when they're younger rather than when they're older, while always being very aware that there are some older people who live very, very isolated lives. And the kind of work that we've done over the years focused on older people has been immensely important and worthwhile. In the last year or two, we have seen some differences between men and women. And I think we can also see in this data a very stark difference. People with health conditions, whether mental or physical, are very, very much more likely to be lonely than people who are not. And finally, the kind of big picture of this is that it does seem that there's been a kind of continuing upwards trend in chronic loneliness from 2020 to 2021 and to 2022, which certainly, if you ask me at the beginning of the pandemic, do you think you're going to see that? I think no, I think we'll get better afterwards. I would have not, I'm really surprised that it has not continued to get better afterwards. It's actually got worse. So that's the kind of starting off point for this discussion. You would have noticed that Kim Leadbeater is not here. About an hour and a half ago, she said she couldn't come because of votes, which obviously is what being an MP is like. I used to work for an MP, and the worst part of the job was ringing someone up to say, "I'm really sorry." Anyway, Omar did that today. But I'm really delighted that Kate Jopling, who's worked with the campaign in many guises and is someone whose thoughts and views about loneliness I immensely value, has been able to step into our panel discussion. The format you're about to hear is a quick bit from me, which is now over. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah O'Grady, who has just been promoted to be the social affairs editor of the Daily Express, who we'll be hearing from our speakers, but then we have a bit of a kind of panel discussion between them before going out to the audience online and in person. And I have to say, I was just looking at who's come today, I was looking at the guest list, and I just couldn't be more delighted about the massive expertise that there is in this room. So thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you'll stick around for some drinks when we finish at 6. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Sarah O'Grady, Social Affairs Editor of the Daily Express newspaper. I'm obviously delighted with the promotion. I'm delighted with the salary increase because any journalist will tell you that the most important byline is the one on your paycheck. I want to say hello to everybody in the room, and also hello and welcome to all of those people who are logging in to watch and take part in this debate internationally, no doubt. And I thought that the best thing to do would be to set the scene for the 5-year anniversary of the Loneliness Strategy, is to recap actually what the Loneliness Strategy was. So you'll forgive me for looking down, but the objectives set out in the 2018 Loneliness Strategy, 3 overarching objectives, were reducing the stigma by building the national conversation on loneliness, drive a lasting shift so that relationships and loneliness are considered in policymaking and delivery by all kinds of organisations. And number 3, playing our part in improving the evidence base on loneliness, which will make a compelling case for action based on hard facts and figures, such as the ones in today's brochure. We have with us, of course, 2 terrific speakers. We have here the economist Noreena Hertz, whose best-selling book, The Lonely Century, A Call to Reconnect, explores how our increasing dependence on technology, radical changes to the workplace, and decades of policies have placed self-interest above the collective good. This damages our communities and makes us more isolated than ever. And on my right, we have, as Robin's just mentioned, last minute sub, Kate Jopling, who is a policy and strategy consultant working extensively on loneliness with several voluntary sector organisations across all kinds of fields, health and care and ageing. Kate authored the final report of the Joe Cox Commission on Loneliness, and is a former director of the International Longevity Centre and this campaign to end loneliness. So I think we'll start with Noreena here, who will spend 5 to 10 minutes telling us what she thinks about the current situation and whether or not, I can ask this of both speakers, we think, or they think, that any or all of those 3 objectives have been met.
Great. Well, thank you. And thanks, thanks, Robin, for inviting me tonight. It's great to be with all of you here this evening. And when Robin told me and I looked at the list of who was attending, I have to say I was in awe and in awe of the incredible things that so many people in this room are actively doing to address loneliness. And it's an honor to be given the opportunity perhaps less on my part to reflect upon how well the government has delivered on strategy, but more perhaps to think about what next, as we're at the 5-year kind of anniversary of when the commission was first, the Minister of Loneliness first came into position, now thinking about the next 5 years. Because as we all know, and as Robin highlighted with his figures, sadly, loneliness hasn't diminished over the past 5 years, but has actually gotten worse. 1 in 5 millennials don't have a single friend or only one. 40% of office workers are lonely at work. 2 in 5 pensioners only have a television or a pet for company. The reality is that despite the brilliant work that so many of you in this room are doing to help people who are experiencing loneliness, there is a limit to how many people you can actually reach, which suggests, I think, that the question we have to ask ourselves in this room is not only how we can continue to help those affected, but what more can we do to prevent loneliness in the first place? Because, and to answer this, I think we need to make explicit that loneliness doesn't exist in a vacuum, but that there is a backdrop, a fusion of causes and effects that together explain why we've become so lonely personally and as a society, that there are root causes and structural drivers that are underpinning it, and that these need to be addressed. And just to be clear about what I mean when I use that phrase, structural drivers, well, just to give 3 examples. The first is, I believe, one of the key reasons we've become so much more lonely over the past 15 years is because the infrastructure of community, public libraries, public parks, youth clubs, public swimming pools has been devastated, diminished, defunded, and destroyed. Unless we have a functioning infrastructure of community, places where people can come together and be together, people are inevitably going to become more disconnected. The second culprit, structural driver, I think, for why things are so much worse is our phones, these weapons of mass distraction that really are, I think, clearly now, and I think the evidence is now clear, taking a huge societal toll when it comes to our mental health and loneliness, especially amongst the young. Social media is in many ways the tobacco industry of the 21st century and needs to be regulated as such. And the online safety bill, unfortunately, with its progressive watering down, I'm not sure will address it sufficiently. And then there's structurally the economic intersection with loneliness, which cannot be overstated. It's not that the rich can't be lonely, of course they can, but what's clear is that the more challenging your economic circumstance, the more lonely you are likely to be. So if we are to make real inroads into addressing loneliness, we need to make sure that people don't feel as abandoned in their times of need as they currently do. So I don't underestimate the challenge we face in seeking to put such issues firmly on the agenda, especially given the current economic environment. But the reality is that loneliness exacts a serious economic cost itself, not only because of the burden it puts on the health system. Lonely people are sicker than people who are not lonely. So it's not just that if you're sick, you're more likely to be lonely, but if you're lonely, you're more likely to be sick. But also because of its negative impact on the economy more broadly. Lonely workers, less motivated, less productive, and more likely to quit than workers who are not. I think in a time like this, we need to stress the economic cost now more than ever if we are to mobilize business as well as government in our common cause. And we need to bring along with us, I'm sure you would all agree, not only business and government, but also the general public, making clear that with their help, together we can co-create a different future, one in which we actively practice community in a more inclusive form, one in which people don't feel this lonely or atomized anymore. the future really is in all of our hands. And it's wonderful to see so many people in this room who want to make a difference. And I'm excited and honoured to be part of this journey. Thank you.
So firstly, just to say, sorry, I'm not Kim, because I think what all of us need on a day like today, when it's sort of a bit hot and it's getting towards the end of the day, is kind of Kim's energy. And I can't promise to bring that because I'm not sure anyone else can, but I'm gonna, you know, maybe try and channel, you know, some of my greatest enthusiasm for loneliness. Just a few reflections on where we've been in the last 5 years. I mean, I think it is still worth repeating and reminding us all that creating the first national strategy on loneliness was a big, bold step. And it was a big, bold step that was turbocharged by Jo Cox in both life and in death. And, you know, we cannot separate what a massive leap Jo enabled through her life and her death. The thing I think the strategy really, really helpfully did, one of the things that was really great about it, and massive kudos to the civil servants who were behind it for putting that in, was this promise to lay the foundations. The strategy was very, very clear that it was not a one-year strategy that then sort of lapsed, but it was about a foundational new approach across government. And I think that is really important to acknowledge. It's still really important. And it did place some of those foundations in place. We have measures of loneliness. We're doing a lot more measurement of loneliness across all ages. That's critically important to how we're able to address this issue, not just at the national level, but in communities. We are starting to build the evidence. We've got government infrastructure around it. You know, we've got teams still working on it. And I think we have much more consistently had a conversation about loneliness. And I think if you think about that process of building the foundations, it was really important in COVID, because it meant that when COVID hit and we were going to see a huge amount of like isolation and therefore probably consequently a huge amount of additional loneliness, we had a foundation to build on. And I think we really need to hold that that's important. That strategy had 60 pledges across 9 departments. That sounds amazing, but a lot of them were very, very low level. I think the honourable exceptions are some of those big ticket items of sort of government infrastructure, but also social prescribing. And I think there was a big investment in social prescribing, but over time, we might have lost the connection to loneliness. I think that's a worry. But I'm not sure we have, since the strategy built on those foundations in the way that we really needed to around big ticket issues like housing in the built environment, like transport, and like the digital divide. And I think the one kind of the challenge on digital is, you know, to sort of Narina's point about the weapons of mass distraction, absolutely, digital technology is transforming the lives of huge numbers of us, but also the lack of access to it is also a massive, massive issue. And it's not just in COVID. People who are digitally excluded are now excluded across a whole range of measures. And that's really problematic. The other big ticket item that we didn't build on was the ambition to strengthen our social fabric. And I think, you know, when you didn't build on that foundation, what has happened over the recent years is that edifice has crumbled. Our social fabric, our social foundations, our libraries, our pools, but also our voluntary sector infrastructure in communities is crumbling. And because we did not continue to build on that, we are seeing problems continuing. So that's my my kind of, you know, 5 years in review in brief of where we've been with strategy. Where would we go? I mean, so Robin asked me to think kind of ambitiously about the next 5 years. And I think what I want to kind of suggest, not sure yet, but, you know, let's discuss it. I think we can take inspiration from those places that have really got on board with loneliness and seen it as a bedrock issue around and a kind of permission to take a very different approach to how we do intervention and policy in a place. And actually, I think we can take, not every local area that's doing stuff on loneliness is doing this, but some are really taking this on board, and it's driving a different way of doing health, doing community, doing care. And I think that that is built on a recognition that relationships are our fuel. They're the fuel of good care, good health, good economic development in communities. But relationships are also our launch pads and our landing pads. So relationships are so, so critical. And I think we can take inspiration from places that really recognise that and build it in. And Labour have been talking about mission-based government, you know, ambitious missions, the moonshot. I still think that ending loneliness should be a mission towards which we aim specifically. And the whole idea of missions is you do lots of other good things along the way. Explicit, you do lots of other good things along the way. But actually the mission to end brackets chronic loneliness, I think is something that we could really power forward with. And I think the reason I think that that's possible is because it's no longer niche to want to rebuild communities and enable people to relate to one another. We see it in agendas like the community power agenda. We see it in agendas like community-based health intervention. Those are the places where we're already seeing other people recognize that if we don't create connection between us, we don't achieve the bigger aims that we want to achieve. So I think there's some fellow travelers on the road on loneliness. But I think it's really important to say that isn't just fluffy stuff. You know, it isn't just you know, doing nice things about, you know, people getting together. It is about, if we're serious about a mission to end loneliness, then we will need to act on those big ticket items like transport, like the regulatory environment around the built environment, and actually also on care. And there's a helpful, reinforcing, positive loop we can get into by building community to rebuild social care. But actually, if we don't provide people with adequate social care, it's one of the reasons you see that strong link between health and care need and loneliness. So, you know, I think we can recognise, as Jo Cox did, that actually loneliness is something that is really effective in uniting people. And I think that's because it speaks to our humanity and our own lived experience. It's a word that people understand instinctively as people, but also it's a really serious issue that brings with it a whole heap of other things that we need to. So I think we shouldn't be embarrassed that the loneliness agenda is big. We should be really proud and positive about the fact that this is a big agenda that requires action across the barriers to connection. It requires support for people that are lonely to connect, and it also requires a real commitment to rebuilding community fabric in a way that I think increasingly is being understood as the way that we're going to get out of this mess. So
to get back to the very beginning, you know, when I first started writing stories about loneliness, and the topic became bigger, it was surrounded then, I think, with more of a stigma. People wouldn't admit that they were lonely, or perhaps they didn't recognize the condition they were in as loneliness. But what do you think about, you know, grassroots, where we're all, you know, the 80-year-old pensioner on the one hand, or the 19-year-old teenager at university? They're embarrassed, perhaps, still to admit that they feel lonely, they're isolated, they can't make friends.
Well, I mean, I think the campaign and all the work you've done has actually done an amazing job in helping to destigmatize the phrase loneliness, and we're discussing it so much more than we ever did. And I think that's really helpful. There's often a wording thing, isn't there? If you ask somebody, do you feel lonely? Somebody will, it's, you know, you're like, well, I don't want to admit that I feel lonely. So you don't say, but there are, even when you look at the ways loneliness is measured, they never actually ask, are you lonely? Because people would tend not to. So I think there are ways of having the conversation even without using the word that can be really useful. But I do feel that we are having this conversation in a way that we weren't 5 years ago. I mean, that's really clear. I just came back from Romania, where my book had just come out in Romanian. And one of the things that all the journalists there asked, they all explained to me that in Romania, nobody talks about any mental health issues, like not only loneliness. So they were kind of, what can we do so that, you know, they said it's such a stigma to talk about anything. And here it's, I think a lot of people, and I think the pandemic, in a way, that was one positive that came out of the pandemic, is we all experienced loneliness in such a profound way and weren't able to meet our friends and socialize, that I think it actually accelerated an open conversation about it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, and slightly not anecdotally, but mainly anecdotally, my experience of speaking to people who are in circumstances where you might assume they are experiencing loneliness, there is a slightly greater comfort with that word, I think. I think the pandemic helped break that stigma down further. You know, in Loneliness Awareness Week, I mean, it is an awareness week, but we had the minister talking about his own loneliness. We've now had several ministers, you know, senior members of the government speaking openly about their own loneliness. That does eventually start to drip through the idea that loneliness is okay to talk about. And I think what still holds people back, and it is very hard to get away from, particularly because quite often you get people saying, well, what about the families? Is the idea that by admitting my loneliness, I'm either admitting something problematic about myself. I think we're breaking down that stigma, but people still feel quite awkward about talking about it with their own loved ones because they feel like it's an accusation about what people haven't done. And I think that might be the next thing that we need to kind of get okay with, is that actually I might have really good relationship with you, but maybe I need more and different and other in order to kind of feel completely fulfilled. So I think, you know, really getting a more sophisticated conversation about loneliness is still a job to do.
And all these projects you currently explained you're working on with Age UK on transport, for example, and getting people out and about there. When is there any one particular method you think is particularly great for helping people who are struggling with those feelings of isolation?
I mean, I think in my conversations with people, I think people find it quite helpful to have permission to talk about loneliness. So I actually think, whilst of course it's true that no one wants to go to the Lonely Club, and I'm not actually sure many people offer things called the Lonely Club, so I'm not really sure where that slightly nonsensical comment comes from. But sure, you don't put that on the door, but I think actually acknowledging and speaking about loneliness is not a bad thing. It can actually free people up to start moving forward. I think actually when it comes to what supports individuals, it is as diverse as people are. You know, what will work for you if you become lonely is not going to be what works for me. Some people love, you know, pet-based therapy, other people love singing choirs, other people love arts. And I think, you know, I'm very skeptical of views that say there's one solution to loneliness. I think the really important thing is to get alongside someone who can help them find it if they can't find it for themselves.
And also make sure that they're the resources and the access, you know, because as you were saying, you know, it's, let's say somebody loves singing, but the nearest choir is, there isn't a bus which is going to get them to the nearest choir, or they can't afford to get to the nearest choir, or they don't have the mobility to get to the nearest choir. Well, that ain't going to work. And so it's that, it's recognizing that the dots have to be joined up, isn't it? It's not just enough to kind of
and I think the cost of living issues are going to have are already having and will continue to have a huge impact on people's ability to maintain connection, because even if things are low cost, transport costs, people are making very difficult calculations. There's also a lot of shame around people who feel that they can't, you know, they might have to buy a cup of tea and they can't afford it. So.
Yeah, I did a lot of research on kind of economics and loneliness, and a lot of those stories, you know, shame, I can't go out, I can't meet someone for a coffee because I can't afford the coffee or whatever, and then people are trapped. So the dots need to be joined up, which is why, you know, we have to, I think, always contextualize loneliness within the political and economic structures in which we exist.
But we can't give everybody, can't pay for everybody's bus pass, can we? I mean, what are the practical elements that would help in this situation? I mean, there are so, the list of things that are being done across the world is so inspiring, as I'm sure many of you in this room are aware. I mean, so many different projects and schemes, from recognizing the importance that local shops play in local communities. So in Belgium, for example, there's a tax on empty shops so that landlords don't keep shops empty for ages, so that they're incentivized to even give them to some community group or things to be in them. So, you know, things that can be done in our physical spaces, a lot around housing, intergenerational housing. There are some great projects in, I just came back from Copenhagen, in Amsterdam, great stuff around intergenerational living. There are projects in South Korea. One of my favorite is daytime discotheques for pensioners. Thousands of people go dancing, and they're called Kolatex, very, very low cost. But because they get so many people going, there's a business opportunity in it. So actually a lot that is being done. Yeah, a lot of good that is inspiring, which isn't, so it's not just about, this isn't about
expecting government necessarily to be the only player here, although it definitely has a role. But it's also about, I think, helping the business community recognize that there's actually there's an opportunity here. You know, there is a market for you here, and increasingly businesses are recognizing this.
You mentioned, you know, the weapons of mass distraction, but
Yeah.
technology also has to play a part, right? It's not all bad.
No, of course, it has been, you know, let me make it more nuanced. You know, there are many people for whom the Facebook group or the kind of Twitter community that they've been able to become part of has actually saved them. I mean, if you're the LGBTQ kid living in the middle of nowhere, being able to find your community is amazing, or people with chronic illness, finding a Facebook group with people with their illness. So, of course, those examples are real and matter, but I started my research very agnostic about the role that social media played in the loneliness epidemic, and having looked at really all the research pretty much out there, I am absolutely convinced that it is a real negative, especially for young people. And there are stories of how lonely social media makes them feel. Of course, there are outliers, but in general, are heartbreaking. The 14-year-old boy who told me about when he would post on Instagram and then be waiting for somebody to like his posts, and when they didn't, just say, I felt so alone. Or the 16-year-old girl whose friends said that they weren't going out after school, but she saw them on her feeds and she said she felt so excluded. And in the past, of course, people could still be excluded, but the teacher might have seen it, or the parent would have seen it. Now, because their social lives are happening on their phone, no one intervenes, and the shame of being excluded is made public. So I think they have a lot to answer for, but it is more nuanced. Yeah.
In your book, you talk about the robots in Japan.
Yes.
Social care, where the residents of the care homes are knitting little bonnets for their social care robots, and of course the robot, they talk to them and chat to them and all the rest of it. I mean, that's obviously not social media. Do you think that's a much more positive use of technology?
I think from an individual perspective, robots and the role that emotional robots can play and are already starting to play in Japan actually can be very positive in terms of alleviating loneliness, however dystopic this may seem to some people in the audience. But the evidence is that people actually feel a lot better. So from an individual level, I think it can have a positive impact. The question I ask though is, what does it mean for society if we subcontract care and compassion to robots? What does it mean if we don't feel compelled to practice kindness, caring for others? How will that erode society? So from a societal perspective, I have real concerns if that were the direction we went, whilst acknowledging that at an individual level, it might actually have a really positive impact. And I've seen a lot of evidence actually of people really saying that they were lonely until they found their companionship in their robot carer. Yeah.
I just think, moving on from that, we could do an awful lot to support paid jobs within this issue, but the volunteer sector does a huge amount. And you mentioned earlier that was perhaps not as strong as it once was. Do you see the number of volunteers in the country building up and increasing, and then moving on with their initiatives?
So as I understand it, the evidence is suggesting that actually we've got a problem with formal volunteering as we currently count it. And from the local organisations I've been speaking to in recent weeks, all of them are reporting challenges in recruiting volunteers to traditional volunteering roles. And that's partly because a whole swathe of volunteers who tended to be older, shielded in COVID and haven't come back. But actually another swathe of people, retirees, are either not retiring or are doing other things with their retirement. Might be childcare, might be a bit of paid work. So I think organisations are struggling for volunteers. Clearly, when we build community, you know, together, particularly when we do things like build associations together or have coffee one, in reality, everybody that forms that community is both a volunteer and a recipient. You know, if you go along to a group, you're making it happen. That is part of that activity. So I think we need to be we can be a bit kind of strict about how we define volunteers and start to worry. I'm not sure there is evidence that we're all more selfish and not helping each other anymore. I'm not sure. I think that we do need to think about how we frame volunteering roles. But I think the reality is that whether that's formal or informal, it needs support. You need an infrastructure to enable that stuff to happen in communities, to kind of seed it, to grow it, but also to keep it inclusive. Because actually what the role that voluntary sector organisations often play is in supporting inclusion. We're very good at humans at creating in-groups, that creates an out-group. What actually the voluntary sector is needed to do is to support inclusion, to support people remembering to kind of not form cliques. And I think, you know, that's why there is a distinct role for voluntary sector in associative life, and the fact that actually the evidence is getting clearer and clearer that that infrastructure is weakest in the more deprived communities that need it the most. That is a real problem. So when I talk about rebuilding social fabric, I'm not talking about, you know, giving more money to ladies in Leafy Surrey. I'm talking about, you know, investing in communities where there was one community that I worked with, like was being talked, I was talking about in Greater Manchester, where they did a local survey of what community space they had, and the only shared space they had in that community was a grass verge. Where do you start when that's the community asset you have on which to build? You've got a lot of work to do, and that requires real commitment. So yeah, I think that's what I would focus on.
But that's the kind of thing perhaps you're talking about in the built environment, where when we build housing developments and so forth, we have to build an infrastructure that includes village halls and so on.
One of the initiatives in Chicago that I was really inspired by was when they built new social housing blocks, they built branches of the Chicago Public Library on the ground floor, so that these kind of new buildings were not only had spaces for the people who living, for the residents, but also became spaces that the entire community would want to come to. So yeah, I think there's real opportunity to think in a really exciting way about how we kind of rebuild the urban space, putting community at its heart.
Well, on from that, how do you think then that we can work together moving forward to make the next 5 years as productive, as successful as the last 5 years?
Well, I think we have great leadership with Robin here in terms of being able to kind of convene and work with everyone in this room and everyone online to help in that mission, because I think you're right, it has to be together. But to pick up on a point that you made, Kate, you know, this has to be co-created. And not just us co-creating, but this has to be co-created, you know, created within communities. You know, I always think about it this way: if we build it, they will come. If they build it, they will stay. And it's kind of, how do we? I think that's the challenge. How do we make this a shared vision and a shared mission? And then how can we all work together in that regard?
I mean, I think the first thing I would say, and I say it a lot, is if you care about loneliness, talk about loneliness. You know, this agenda won't be fine if you leave it alone. This will fall off people's radar. And I think if you care about loneliness and loneliness is the thing you care about, don't get distracted, talk about loneliness. And I think, you know, as Robin mentioned earlier, we're doing some work to kind of refresh a call to action for the next 5 years. You know, please join in that effort. I think it's really important that we're very clear that the work of loneliness is not done, and that actually we want to be stronger and bolder in the next phase. You know, this isn't time to tail off. So.
Thank you both. We're going to open up the floor now to questions.
Hi, I'm Fenella. I do the podcast called Conversations to Connect in collaboration with Campaign to End Loneliness. You've mentioned a lot about social infrastructure, but you haven't spoken that much about workplace loneliness. And I know that like we're only now seeing some of the impacts of the fact that many companies don't have offices anymore. There is no shared space to go. Even just from talking to my friends and young people, so many people are literally just working every day, staring at a screen by themselves. So is there something that, in a way, like I feel like this is only going to get worse over the next few years? What is the role of companies and government to really look at this and tackle this in your view?
So a lot of companies are realizing that this is a problem, for them. And I've been speaking to a lot of kind of senior executives and CEOs who recognize this, are worried, want to know what they can do in the workplace, because as I said, the evidence is really clear. Lonely workers are less motivated, less productive, more likely to quit. In fact, the single biggest determinant for whether somebody will feel engaged with their job is whether or not they have a friend there. So, and hybrid work, working remotely is definitely corroding work relationships and also making work much more commodified and transactional. And companies realize this and are starting to really, a lot of companies recognize this and are starting to really think about it. So that's, I think, the good news. But we shouldn't romanticize the workplace of the past, because my research, most of which was done on work pre-pandemic, showed that the workplace pre-pandemic was a really lonely place for many people, with weirdly, counterintuitively, open plan offices actually proving to be the worst when it came to people feeling connected or connected to each other. Basically, because when so this move to work in open plan offices, which we'd seen over the previous decade, promising to bring people more together, actually proving to do the opposite, because when you're in an open plan office, it's of course much harder to have an honest, meaningful conversation with anyone, because it's you risk being overheard. People will put on their noise cancelling headphones, as I used to when I worked in an open plan office, not to kind of interact. And in fact, research shows that in open plan offices, people are much more likely to communicate with their colleagues in the same room by email or message than speak to them face to face. So I think, it's more than just space, and it's also about, and it's more than just having social activities for your staff as well. But there are things that companies can do, eating together, really proven way of helping staff feel more connected. And it's also, of course, loneliness at work is about feeling that you don't have a voice and that you're not recognized. And so it's about addressing that as well.
Well, so I would refer you to my recent report for the Campaign to End Loneliness and British Records on workplace loneliness. But I mean, so to challenge, the evidence did not back up the idea that working from home is more lonely than working in office. There was not a correlation. And in fact, where people had to change their working environment during the pandemic, which we know was to home in the main, hugely much to home-based working, most reported that they had seen a change in their relationships, but most saw that change in positive in both their workplace relationships and their personal relationships. And the really important thing, I think, also to say about the shift in working is that it has enabled people to improve relationships in other aspects of their life often. So people maybe have less relationship with their colleagues, but maybe that's not what's important to them, but maybe they're spending more time with their friends and family, and that might be what's important to them and enables them to be less lonely. That said, workplace loneliness is an issue. I don't think there's a simplistic solution that says being together is the solution, is the answer, because for all the reasons Marina says, actually, if the relationship is toxic, or you feel disempowered, or you hate your work, that's not going to help. I think what we need to do is think about relationships in the workplace really seriously and enable people to have conversations about that. And I would love to start from a small number of workplaces doing a really good job of this in actually talking to people. You could even build it into a proposal. How are your relationships? How are you feeling about how things are going in the workplace? Making that an important metric of how this place is to be. I mean, you know, I think work takes up huge amounts of our time, and sitting in your bedroom alone when you don't know anyone at work clearly sounds pretty terrible. But I think we just need to not play into the hands of those people who, for mainly reasons of real estate value, want us back in the office. It's not the solution.
Although I
necessarily.
think the research I've seen, I don't know how granular your research was on age groups, but
It didn't. it
okay,
didn't
so
separate.
the research on kind of younger people, because sure, I can see that there might well be people for whom it's a better setup, but there are a lot of younger people who are literally in their bedrooms on their screen and
So
feeling
our
yeah,
research
disconnected.
showed there was not
Yeah.
a difference by age, as in, not that it didn't break it
Oh,
down.
I see.
Yeah.
You didn't.
So I mean,
Okay,
the results were not what I was expecting. I must say, in all cases, but yeah, they were what they were, and I think I think really what it attested to is just there's so much nuance
as ever.
in why we might be lonely, and when and how.
And we also have questions, I think, coming in online. Robin?
Yes, we do actually. So one of them was particularly about social media and what it is that you think is kind of driving some kind of worries about social media. Is it because people are actually more kind of socially isolated, or is it that it's something like the setup of certainly some social media apps that drives us to kind of compare ourselves with other people's social interactions? So is it kind of changing our social interactions, or is it making us think about the same social interactions but in a more negative and unhelpful way?
So what I found is it does a number of things. First of all, it migrates our social interactions, primarily when we're talking about young people. Their social interactions are being migrated to such a significant degree online, and all the evidence shows that online relationships are just lesser, less empathetic, less deep, less meaningful. Again, there are going to be exceptions, but as a whole, so part of it is the quality of the interaction. The more an interaction is stripped away from a face-to-face, the kind of less strong it is, the research shows. And then there's the toxicity, of course, of the debate on social media. You know, if you're just even if you're not in the fire yourself, if you're just exposed to that toxicity, it can easily make you feel more alone in this awful world. And then, yes, the belief that everyone's more popular than you are. I mean, we all can look at our social media feeds and it just can seem like everyone has more friends. Everyone's doing more things with other people. And so there's a kind of relative comparison, I think, which plays a role as well. And, you know, it'd been clear for many years that there was a very clear correlation between social media usage amongst young people and loneliness. But it was only in 2019 that researchers started doing kind of gold standard type studies where they would take a group of people who were on social media and then compare them directly with a group who were told to stop being on social media for a period. And the results time and time again were clear. When young people went off social media for a month, for 2 months, even for a week, they felt significantly less lonely, significantly happier, and significantly less depressed.
I mean, yeah, largely I agree with that. I mean, I think in the conversations I had, and I had some extremely emotive conversations in the run-up to last Mental Health Awareness Week, the Mental Health Foundation. I interviewed people who had experience of deep loneliness and also mental health issues. And social media was mentioned across all of those conversations. And the particular thing that came out often was its role in setting false expectations. And people knew they were false expectations. Most people don't, there aren't really flies on them at one level. They know what it's doing to them, but it's kind of addicting. And they know it's setting up a false expectation, but it's hard to recalibrate for. I think the one thing that I heard quite recently in another conversation that was happening was somebody was saying, you know, the trick though on this social media question is how do we move away from hand-wringing into something positive, and potentially we might have to accept this is what's going to happen and give people a set of skills to deal with it more than we can actually hope to ever stop.
Hi there, my name's Jamie. I'm from the On Purpose Associate Programme. a lot of the organizations in the charity, volunteer and social enterprise sector are doing work which is helping reduce loneliness, but perhaps inadvertently so. So if you're Sport England and you're encouraging young people to take part in activities in sports, you're going to be helping reduce isolation. Or if you're Stonewall and you're encouraging better diversity, equity, inclusion training in the workplace, you're going to be helping people in those workspaces feel more included. But a lot of these organizations aren't measuring for loneliness or isolation, and they're not metrics that their services are evaluated on. And the conversation today is making me think about maybe perhaps we're still at the stigma stage, and actually we really need to be raising awareness across society more widely about the importance of talking about loneliness openly. And it makes me think of the NSPCC with their Full Stop campaign, raising awareness of child abuse. They ran that for a decade. And it was only after 10 years that people were then comfortable talking about it and then saying, okay, what are organizations going to do? What are we going to do about it? So my question is, actually, do we really just need to focus on trying to raise awareness of loneliness still?
Great question. But if we want to increase the number of volunteers in our society and voluntary organizations, I'm wondering the idea of another round of paperwork or more bureaucracy, is that helpful?
I mean, yes, that is the challenge. And that's the reason a lot of organisations don't measure their impact on loneliness, because it does require a before and after measure to do it properly, and actually you need to be properly trained to do it, because otherwise people do get quite worried about doing it. I don't think there is any evidence it's harmful and it can't be weaved into conversations, but you have to know how to do it well. So it's not easy to measure loneliness in practice, and I think the campaign is going to bring some stuff out on more detail and evaluation loneliness soon, so just watch this space. But the one thing I think you're absolutely right about is that there is a lot of work that happens that it addresses loneliness, and it would be really helpful if we kind of picked that up and recognise that. I mean, quite often I hear people say, but there's no work done for young people and loneliness. And I say, well, youth work is extremely socially based, relational working with young people, which recognises the importance of connections. If that's not addressing loneliness, I don't know what would. So I think it's not true that we don't have any models, for example, for addressing loneliness among certain groups. We just don't always name them. And so I don't have a perfect answer, but I think you make an important point.
Yeah, I think you make an important point too, and maybe off the cuff, maybe we could be looking at metrics to show how organizations are helping people connect, and use that as a proxy rather than measuring loneliness per se. I think that could be really easier to articulate and quantify, and essentially be a convincing proxy.
Hi, I'm Naomi Phillips. I am formerly of the Red Cross and was very proud to be part of the Jo Cox Commission and all the work that went on from there. And I'm currently at a research and development organisation think tank called Learning and Work Institute, and we are unsurprisingly interested in learning, work, economics, and so on. If we're thinking about action for the next 5 years, what is the kind of underexplored, or what is the next bit of really strong economic research that would be really helpful in terms of influencing the Treasury?
Well, I think there is this research already to build upon around the cost and productivity, which is something really on the government's mind a lot, and will continue to be, whoever is in power next. So I think really kind of digging deeper into that strand of economic metrics. And then, of course, there's been great work done on the economic cost to the NHS of loneliness, but building upon that, I mean, those are two kind of really obvious ones. And then there is kind of a literature that I've been looking into more recently, into kind of in a way that corollary of how connections can the more connected a society is and feels to each other, the more innovative it is. And you see this, there's like kind of research that shows like countries where people feel more connected, more cohesive, have more patents and more scientific kind of discoveries. So there is also looking at it that way around. So I think there is, I learned the hard way very early in my career that being able to articulate the business case for a lot of this stuff can go a really long way in getting things done. I mean, one of the first events I ever spoke at back in 2001, after my first big book came out on globalization, I spoke at this audience of hedge fund managers, and I gave this speech, which was like, you, the winners of globalization, shouldn't be eating your foie gras whilst homeless people are on the street. And basically people just looked at me in shocked silence, and there was like no applause at the end, and it was awful. And then I came away thinking, I failed here, because actually I need to think about what matters to this audience and how can I make my case in the language that they will understand, and how can I get them engaged. And so I really started realizing that I needed to kind of think about these issues and articulate them in that way that you're saying. So I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot that can be done, and feel free to reach out to me kind of separately on that.
I was wondering, I'm sorry, Ivo from Good Gym. I wondered if there's any sort of evidence, any connection between adversity and connection in that zone. So anecdotally in our work, we see where we sort of build connection through volunteering, but basically the harder the task, it seems to be, the stronger the sense of community at the end of it.
In terms of evidence, I don't know of any. That doesn't mean there isn't any, because I don't have a database in my head. I think, though, what there is evidence around is how relationships of purpose are really, really important to addressing loneliness. And that's why, when you ask Mary to help with the teas at the coffee morning, it's actually much more important to her and becomes a much bigger part of her life, and she's much more likely to feel connected than when she just turns up and has the tea. Although actually, personally, I think we should reinforce everyone that just turns up and has the tea. But so I think there's a thing about having purpose that kind of would seem to flow through to that. And I would love to kind of try and work out why people do Tough Mudder and all that sort of stuff, because, it does seem a bit weird. But yeah, I think the point about purpose and what the relationship is for and shared endeavor, there's really good evidence around that. So you can kind of build out from where you are. Yeah, and I'd love your anecdotal evidence around moving safer. Brilliant.
I looked at communities and how they strengthened during the Blitz. So this was before the pandemic. So I kind of looked at that. And then as we were going through those early moments of the pandemic, and there was that kind of initial, at least, surge of community and people helping each other out. And when we all stood and kind of clapped for the carers, there were those moments. I think so that was another example of adversity. So I think there's something probably in that, whether we should engineer more adversity. I'm not sure, but I think you also made a really important point about this kind of move to digital, which has been accelerated through the pandemic. So shopping online, ordering food online, rather than going to a place, ordering your book on Amazon, rather than going to a bookshop. And I think there is a real danger that we are unwittingly trading off connection and community for convenience. And it is something that we need to be really mindful about, and could be part, I think, of a campaign to get people back to face-to-face, in-person interaction.
Thank you. I think we are drawing a very interesting, very hot hour to an end here. Let's hope the wine is chilled. I'm going to say thank you to both our speakers. Thank you to the Campaign to End Loneliness. I'm going to finish by reminding people, from my point of view, that it's great to have all the research, all the facts and the stats, etc. But it's individual stories and human interest stories that interest, journalists like myself. So when you put together all your reports and your research, really to get it into the newspapers, you need the storytellers, the case studies. And please bear that in mind as you do your interviews. Ask people, would you tell your story? Would you mind if a photographer from the Daily Express comes along? And it's just so much easier for you know, for reporters like myself to sell massively important issues like this into newspapers with that personal story. Okay.